Hey everyone, just wanted to hop on here before the episode this week with some programming notes and some scheduling things coming up and what's coming on Svarm Chatter. So, besides for the regular kind of episodes, and I'll mention some of things that are coming, there'll be an episode for Purim and then Pesach. So, first of all, Mr. Shem, recording an episode with Yeshua Hartman of Moral fame, and it'll be about the drasha of the Maral on Shabbos Haggadah. The Maral gave a Shabbos Haggadah drasha that was published. It's the only one we have. I'm sure he gave more than one. And so we'll be discussing that. This was published in a new edition with notes in a pretty massive volume by Rabbi Hartman last year through Mechon Yerushalayim. So we'll be discussing that. Sponsorship opportunities are available. That should be a really good episode. We'll be discussing at least one episode on the blood libel, specifically as it pertains to late 19th, early 20th century blood libels in Europe. An episode on the Minchas Chinuch about mitzvahs related to Pesach, so matzah, maror, chametz, those kind of things, as well as just in general a lot of kind of the standard podcast episodes. I'll mention some of them. I have a 2.5-hour episode, so it'll be the longest episode on the podcast of about the Eger Soferim, which is the letters of the Eger Sofer family, Rikve Eger, Reb Shalom Eger, Chassam Sofer, Ksav Sofer, etc. So the Sefer is fascinating. A lot of really interesting material for those who are familiar or not familiar. There's a new edition that just came out, as of actually not available yet in stores in America as of this recording, but it will be. So if there's that sponsorship available for that episode. And then just a lot of other various interesting episodes. I can just mention some here. There's something about the Sefer HaChinuch. I have an episode about the Wurzburger Rav. There's an episode about the biography of Shlomo Gansfried, something about the Eim Labino of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the Ivitz, the Sefer HaTorah that was printed from manuscript. Something on the history of Masada, Jewish soldiers in the Union Army during the Civil War. And there's Jews of Jamaica, Jews of the Netherlands, and a whole bunch of others that are, again, and many more episodes that are recorded and planned. So if anyone is interested in any of these in sponsoring, email me, svarmchatter@gmail.com. Now, as well, I will also like to mention, I've mentioned, I think 2 or 3 times on the podcast that there's a new series coming. I know people enjoyed the series very much. Last year was Shabbos Tzvi series. So there are actually 2 series planned. One is almost done being recorded. It's a lot bigger than I had planned originally. And then there's another one that I'm just a couple episodes in so far. So one is a series on the Jews of Spain, Spanish Jewry. That's a pretty interesting, pretty big series. There's another one that I will term it as also very interesting and kind of fun in some ways. I'll kind of compare it to the Shabbos Tzvi, even though it's very different, but just that kind of fun, quote unquote. So, and fascinating, really. So if anyone is interested in learning more or sponsoring, email me, svarmchatter@gmail.com. Again, and just for any episode, if anyone's interested in sponsoring or just supporting the show with any amount, it is appreciated. I will put a link to do so via PayPal. That's through the website, svarmchatter.com, which you should check out if you haven't. Or you can email me again, svarmchatter@gmail.com for Zelle or any other information, or just comments or feedback about the podcast, about episodes, as well as if you have any suggestions for different episodes and that kind of thing. And finally, for all of you that have rated the episode, especially on Apple, rating and reviewing, very much appreciated, but you can do that as well on Spotify and other places as well. And if you haven't, please subscribe to the episode and to the podcast and tell people about the podcast. And thank you, and hope you enjoy this week's episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Elisheva Baumgarten, who holds the Professor Yitzchak Becker Chair for Jewish Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And we'll be discussing her brand new book, which is titled Biblical Woman and Jewish Daily Life in the Middle Ages, published by Penn University Press. And she's written a number of other books, which we'll discuss, perhaps also will come up. And so thank you, Professor Baumgarten, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, so as you can hear from my English, I was born in New York. I grew up in Canada. I made Aliyah when I was 15. After serving in the army and going to Midrashah, I did most of my studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Then I did a postdoc at Penn. I taught at Bar Ilan for 12 years, where I was one of the founders of the Gender Studies program, and I taught in the Department of Jewish History. And for the past 9 years, I've been teaching at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where I teach in two departments. I teach in the Department of Jewish History and the Department of History, something that for North American listeners might be a little bit different, because usually you just have a Department of History and people who study Jews are part of that department. The Israeli academic reality is that we have departments of Jewish history. And I am one of the first people, and I'm very proud of it, who has a position in both the Department of History and the Department of Jewish History. And one of the reasons is because I believe that you can't study Jews in the past without understanding the people amongst whom they lived. So for me as a medievalist, I study the Jews of Ashkenaz in the Middle Ages, roughly from the First Crusade, so that's 1096, or from the time of Rashi until the 14th century. So more or less the Black Death, but we can kind of stretch that to the end of the 14th century. So you could say the time of Maharil, if we have to go by famous Jewish rabbis. I study the Jews of medieval Ashkenaz, but I believe very firmly that you can't understand their lives if you don't understand the Christian realities in which they lived.
Okay, so something interesting about your books. So there's this new book. There's another book you wrote, Practicing Piety in Medieval Ashkenaz. You've also written Mothers and Children, Jewish Family Life in Medieval Europe. So you've written a bunch of, and edited, and written other articles and other things. So this is all about kind of like a social history, broadly speaking, right? So not only about Rabbanim, also, you're trying to look at, and we'll talk about this book, especially how you try to look at the lives of women and everyday life, everyday regular people, so to speak. So when and how did you get interested in that and researching that and looking into that for all the books?
So I think, as a graduate student, I was fascinated by the world of halakha in the Middle Ages and by how much everyday information there was in that world. It really started with Professor Yisrael Tashma, Zichrono Livracha, with whom I took a seminar, and other teachers, Professor Avram Grossman, the man who became ultimately my doctoral supervisor, Professor Robert Bloomfield, and all of them wrote different great works on the rabbis. And to me, the most fascinating thing about medieval Jewish rabbis was that, as opposed to their Christian counterparts, who were all monks, who were all celibate, who didn't have families, medieval rabbis had families. And it really bothered me that we knew nothing about their families. We knew nothing about the realities they lived in, although everyone was very quick to talk about the fact that Jews and Christians were so different because of the fact that they had families. There was almost no one who could say anything what that family actually meant. And I can even perhaps tell an anecdote that when I was a graduate student, I once took Ephraim Elimelech Urbach's Baalei Tosafot, and I went through it. It's a history of all the rabbis from the Middle Ages, for those of you who don't know the book. And it goes kind of Rav by Rav, generation by generation, family by family. And I could only find the name of 10 women. And it really bothered me that we knew that, Rabbeinu Tam had a sister, Rabbanit Chana, who did lots of great things, and she was a Morat Halacha in different ways. And Rashi had these daughters that everyone knows how to talk about and tell all these stories about. Even great novels have been written about it, right? And nobody knew how to say anything about these people. And I thought to myself, these people shaped the practice of the Jewish people, no less, these women shaped the practice of the Jewish people, no less, in my opinion, than the men they lived with. And how did they influence the men they lived with? So these were really my first questions. My first quest was to bring the women back into Jewish history, into medieval Jewish history. And I was fascinated by the Middle Ages for two reasons. One reason is because of current historiography, which perhaps is of less interest to this podcast, which is that just really fascinating work was being done on medieval women at the time, medieval Christian women, most of whom were nuns. And I was just fascinated by that work from a historiographic perspective. But the other thing that really fascinated me was that there was so much in the sources that no one had ever looked at. And people said to me, you're not going to find anything. And in the end, I think I could have written, I can write so much more, and my students can write so much more, and their students will be able to write so much more. And there's so much there that nobody really looked at before.
So that's really what I would ask you about all the books, and then specifically we'll get into specifically this book, what sources you use here. But sources, right? You said you want to look at what the lives of women were and just everyday people. But that's and while a lot of Sfarim have written on the Baalei Tosfos and all the Chavri Sfarim, Rabbanim, Gedolim, whatever words you want to use, but isn't that have to do with the lack of sources that we have? So what kind of sources in general did you find to use in all your works to work through to kind of, I don't know if the right word is reconstruct or show what their lives were like?
I'm not sure we can really reconstruct because we can't really go back in time. And I think one of the things I've kind of decided over the years is that I would rather be a modern woman than a medieval woman, definitely from a medical point of view and from lots of other perspectives. But I think that going back to the Middle Ages and reading the sources, first of all, the first thing I did was look at halakha. So look at halachic sources, look at sources in Hebrew. That's what I could read. That's what I knew how to read. And I was very, very proud to be a woman who was able to read those sources. Being a medieval scholar requires a lot of mileage, both in Talmud and classical rabbinic sources, but also in medieval Rishonim sources. And I think my generation of women is really the first generation that has raised Talmidot Chachamim that could start to do that. I think my students today are far more capable of doing it than I was or I will ever be, because they've had the opportunity to go to other places where they've got an even better training. So I'm really proud of my students who do this. But the other thing I brought to the table, which is no less important, was that I could read French and German and Latin. And I could compare two medieval sources that were written by Christians or about Christians. So I could take the questions that were being asked by social historians who had already asked these questions in the 80s and early 90s about Christian women or about Christian families or about Christian people, and start saying, how would these questions play out if I asked them about Jews? And that's what I did in my first book. My first book was Mothers and Children. And I said, okay, we know so much about, the halakha, what it requires of fathers from children. Think of what we have in Masechet Kiddushin, all the mitzvot that are on fathers for their children. And I said, okay, what can we know about mothers? What do we find out about them? A lot of my colleagues were actually really offended that I called the book Mothers and Children. And they said, there are a lot of fathers in that book. Like, why did you call it Mothers and Children? And I said, because I wanted the spotlight to allow other people to shine. And I think at the beginning, it really was feminist quest, a women's history quest, a kind of 90s project. It was a 90s project. I finished in 2001. So it was a 90s project that I did for a number of years. And that's where I started, trying to understand how children were born and brought up. I want to give just one example because I think it might be telling. One of the things I did as a graduate student was read a lot of Kitvei Yad. I still do. A good day is when I can open Kitvei Yad and just enjoy them and see the actual words that medieval Jews wrote. We also had some sofrot, who were usually daughters of sofrim. So we have even manuscripts written by women, but most manuscripts are certainly written by men. And one of the things I did at the very beginning was just try to get used to reading these manuscripts. And I loved reading through Sidurim, for example, which was a book that usually was given to women in the copies we have from the Middle Ages, because those tefillot resonate with us today. And I can say the same tefillot today, and I know those tefillot and I'm familiar with them. But I came across a ktav yad that's very well known, Sefer Asufot, beautiful Ashkenazic square handwriting. And in the middle, I found V'kach omrot hamiyaldot hachachamot. This is what the wise midwives say. So of course, I tried to figure out what was there, and I start reading everybody who's ever written on this ktav yad, and everybody skips my 2 pages. The 2 pages that interest me, everybody skips. And Nehemiah Brul, who wrote in the 19th century, he says, this is kind of Narishkeit. That's almost the word he uses. I don't remember the German word he uses there. And he says the only reason it's important is they mention one Gaon from Bavel who we don't know of from other sources. So he's mentioned there with some kind of medicine that the miyaldot, that these midwives are using. It ended up being a chapter from a book that's well known that was written by a medieval circumciser, or by 2 medieval circumcisers, a father and son, Rabbi Yaakov and Rabbi Gershom from Worms in the 13th century. They wrote the first manual we know for Mohalim. It was published in the 19th century without my chapter. And my chapter is what Rabbi Gershom learned from the midwives. Now, this is super interesting. First of all, you can see that a man is mediating. He's writing down what he's hearing from the midwife. So you learn something about how medicine works in that world. Women probably couldn't write it down, but they could tell him what to do. And he says things like, go out to the river here in Worms. You can find the plant I'm talking about it. It looks like this. And he draws a little picture of it. You can look for my article. And I'm not going to go into all the details. But the other thing that was super exciting was there were tons of materia medica. There were tons of refuot in their German names, with their German names. And I went to Hildegard of Bingen, who wrote a book about medieval medicine. And I could find all of them. And they were very similar. And the even more exciting thing is that we don't have any comparable document in Latin, medieval German. Here we have it in Hebrew, the first practical midwifery manual. We don't have this anyplace else. So for me, this was really to meet the medieval women, hear their voices, and work with them. And what the point I'm actually trying to make now, and then I'll stop this point, is that my interests asking about medieval women was something people hadn't asked before. All the yeshiva boys who've studied Sefer HaSukkot hundreds of times and pored over it, they didn't ask those questions. And here I was finding medieval voices that no one had found before. So for me, at least at the beginning of my work, that was really exciting to find these women's voices, sometimes to hear them fighting with the Rabbanim, hear them saying, no, we're going to do this. No, you can't tell us what to do. That was really, really exciting for me. And that was my first project. And I really focused on early childhood. It was an easy place to look because that was when mothers were really very involved in the chinuch, in the upbringing of their children.
Okay, so now we get to this new book. We'll get to the other books perhaps at the end. This new book where you use kind of, as you say, biblical women. You look how they were looked at in Tanakh. So I'll just mention here. You look at Chava, you look at Dvar Yael, Abigail, Yiftach's daughter. There's a couple here. There's a couple here that you look at. So how do you use these sources? Why did you settle on these sources? And how do you engage in them? What are you trying, and what does the book do with these sources?
Okay, so if we fast forward a little bit, over the years I've become less and less interested only in women. And my second book, which I won't talk about now at length, really compared between women and men. So it was a truly gendered study. If you use the word gender, what it means, that it's the difference between men and women. And it looked at women and men, Jewish and Christian women and men. And then after a while, I came to a new formulation, which was that I was interested in anybody who wasn't part of the elite. Now, the elite were usually men. So I was interested, elite men had wives and they were pretty high class, but they weren't as elitist as their husbands, obviously. And the new formulation I've been using over the past few years with all my students is that I study beyond the elite. And I'm really interested in practice, what people actually did. I'm not only interested in the ideology they used to explain it, although that's interesting, I'm interested in why they did what they did and what they did on an everyday basis. So I started, and this was like kind of a project that went on for many years. I collected, one example, then another example, then another example, then another example. I started collecting examples of how women's practices are explained, especially practices that seem to be new, because when practices are new, they need explanations, or if a new explanation comes up. And I discovered that in so many cases, what the Rabbanim do is they call on biblical figures. They don't use a passage from the Talmud. They don't use a passage from the Geonim. They don't use a passage from Alei HaTosafot. They use a biblical story to explain a practice that is very new, very interestingly, often with Christian parallels from the biblical exegesis of the time. So I started kind of following all these cases, and I guess the criteria for my book is a biblical figure who has a practice, or a practice that has a biblical figure attached to it. And because the way women were taught was often by stories, women's practices are the easiest to get at. But I could also talk about David or Rabbi Akiva or Avraham or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I could talk about lots of other figures. Some of them I've written about within the book, and some of them I've written about in other articles. But I decided that the best way to focus the book in the end was to write about the women, and that the women would be my exemplar for anyone who was not elitist, because they're the biggest group of people who were not part of the elite. And Jewish communities were very small. So if we have 50 or 70 or 100 people, or even 50 families in a community, still we could have, 10 elite families among them, and then it would be harder to talk about the men. So this is the kind of the hook I found for this book. I will also say that this book was kind of a book on the way. I really want to write now, and that's what I hope my next book will be, a book about medieval marriage. There's been a lot of work done on the halacha of medieval marriage, what you were allowed to do from a halachic point of view, but there's been very little work done on the social history of marriage, and I'm interested in social history. I'll just give you one example. If you read the research that's been done over the past 50 years since Yaakov Katz about the halacha of marriage, you would think that minor girls were getting married all the time in medieval Ashkenaz. Girls under the age of 12 or 12 and a half were getting married. I would argue that's very rare. And that's the difference between a history of halacha that takes every case that some rabbi mentions in a psak and makes simus out of it, which is, of course, fantastic, to my kind of work, which is collect as many sources as you can from as many places you can get it. Poetry, stories, halacha, piyutim, perushei mikra, perushei Talmud, medieval Latin poetry, prayers, artwork, anything you can find, and see what happens when you throw it all in together. You'll find discrepancies between the sources, but you'll also find things that echo between all the sources, and then you have a story to tell.
all those sources that you just mentioned, poetry, and we mentioned the Prushim and Svarim and everything, all the sources that you just mentioned, to be clear, those are used in this book, but you're just using how they viewed the biblical figure, so to speak, right? Is that accurate?
I think I do more than that. I think, I'm trying to make another argument that maybe I'll say in a minute, but I think what I try to do is I try to get from these various sources to the actual practice and think about how people explained it to themselves. Because the way we explain what we do is no less important than what we actually do. And what I was trying to argue was that the biblical figures were very much alive in the medieval Ashkenazic imagination, in the medieval imagination at large, also in the Christian imagination, but in the medieval Ashkenazic imagination, certainly. And there is an argument here that's very important, or there are two arguments here that are very important to me. One is people often ask, what did medieval Jewish women know? Could they daven? Could they read? And my answer is perhaps we have to define literacy a little bit differently. First of all, I think they could read. They could say the tefillot. They could read basic Hebrew. That's why when Yiddish came around, women could read Yiddish so well, because they knew the letters. And I would even argue that women often taught their sons their basic letters before they went to the medieval cheder or the equivalent of cheder, whatever we want to call it. But I also would argue that they were literate, even if they couldn't, write long things. And many medieval people couldn't write, they could only read. But even if they couldn't write, long perushim or long stories or whatever it is, certainly not in Hebrew, I would argue that they were literate in the sense that they knew the stories. The stories were part of their repertoire. And that's a different kind of literacy. It's not literacy of actually being able to read, but it's literacy of what you know. And some scholars have called that, a biblical literacy. They were literate in the stories of the Tanakh. And that's how they were taught. They were taught through stories. So that's one argument I wanted to make. The other argument I wanted to make is perhaps a little bit more controversial, but I'll dare to tell you about it now anyway. And I think that one of the things that's happened in medieval studies, medieval Jewish studies I'm talking about now, with the focus on Chachamim and on the Rabbanim, is that we've become what one of my colleagues has called, and I'm not saying she's wrong, the people of the Talmud. In other words, the Talmud has become very, very central. The poskim, the rishonim, the pirushim of the Talmud, everything that was done with the Talmud has become very, very central. And in fact, even in Jewish-Christian relations, Amos Finkelstein wrote years ago a very famous article, which he kind of embellished in other pieces he wrote, in which he tried to argue that Jews in the Middle Ages stopped being the people of the Bible and they started being the people of the Talmud. I would say, yes, Jews were the people of the Talmud, but they were still the people of the Bible. And part of the purpose of my book was to show how central the Tanakh was in the eyes and in the lives of medieval Jews. And just for example, if you go to cemeteries, another one of my future projects. So if you want to know my future projects, I just told you I want to write a book about marriage, and then I want to write a book about death. So I kind of want to go through the life cycle. So I've done birth. I've kind of done the middle of life in my last two books. I want to do marriage. I want to do death. So I've been working a lot over the past years on tombstones, and they feature a lot in this book. There are a lot of tombstones in the different chapters in this book. And I've looked at the text on women's and men's tombstones. There's so many psukim that are quoted, so many biblical figures that are called upon. And that really tells us what people's ideals are. Of course, a matzeva, just like a eulogy, cannot be taken, at face value. This is what you're saying about somebody, to lelamed zchut, or to be saying nice things about them after they die. But it still teaches us about people's ideals, right? And if we choose to say that somebody's beautiful or wise or charitable or chassidah, we're saying something about our values of the time.
Okay, so this book, like I already mentioned, there's a couple different chapters. So let's talk a little bit about the book, about the chapters. So the first chapter and the second one, the first one you look at Chava, the second one you look at the Mois, and you go through kind of, as you term it in the beginning, those talk about domestic responsibilities, like you said, marriage, motherhood, all these kind of things. The second chapter, the next chapters you talk about Dvaira and Yael, women's communal leadership. Then you focus on Avigail, the fourth chapter. And the fifth chapter you focus on martyrdom, Kiddush Hashem. A lot of things. This is unfortunately all too common in Ashkenaz, as I'm sure many listeners know.
I'm going to stop you, if that's okay. I'm stopping you because the fifth chapter, from my point of view, is not about martyrdom. The fifth chapter, from my point of view, is about the yearly cycle. It's about how Bat Yiftach was made part of the yearly cycle, and how her tradition from the Tanakh, Al Ken Telachna Bnot Yisrael Yamima Tanot Bat Yiftach, 4 times a year, which is what we read in the Tanakh, how that is alive in medieval Ashkenaz, how they attribute ideas that have to do with martyrdom to that, but we can understand here how people set their world in order. So the chapter about Chava is about how you set being a woman in order. The chapter about the mothers is how you set ritual life in the shul, how you use the mothers within ritual life in the shul. The chapter is mainly about the Mishaberachs. In other words, it's about the Mishaberachs and the place that those mothers play in kind of your everyday ritual and your everyday fears, including giving birth and other things, but also being sick, also giving tzedakah. They were called upon in different contexts. The chapter about Dvorah and Yael, maybe we can get back to later, and about Abigail, they're a little bit different. But the chapter about Yiftach is really the yearly ritual cycle. And it's my way of saying, look at how the Bible framed all these things. Being a person, being a woman, being part of a community, being part of the yearly cycle.
So let's say a little about those chapters, and we can leave the middle chapters out after you do the beginning and the end. And I will say, just let me mention something now about the book. The book is a little bit bigger than a regular book. It's glossy paper, and there's a beautiful, colorful illustrations. Anyone is familiar with manuscripts, especially from this period. There's some beautiful, colorful illustrations, and just the handwriting in the manuscripts. So there's a lot of that, and we're doing this audio, so there's no visual. You can't see it, but anyone, there'll be a link to purchase the book, and some of these are probably online. You can Google some of these pictures from the famous, Haggadah and other, this picture of the bird's head Haggadah and other things. So let's talk about the first ones. For example, how you go through. You talk about Chala, you talk about Alakas Neris, you talk about Nida. There's a lot of other things. So talk about, the first chapters and the end chapters, kind of the beginning and the end, and give some examples of what you do here.
Okay, so I'll just say that all the pictures were really in there so that people could see what medieval people saw. In other words, I wanted my modern readers to be able to see what medieval people saw. And again, this has to do with literacy. Even if you can't read, you can look at pictures. A lot of the pictures come from Haggadot. Women were regularly at the Seder. They were reading the Haggadah. So I wanted the Haggadot to be there. So that's one of the reasons there's so many pictures. And I guess the other thing is that it's really just a great advantage. I've had an amazing research grant the past years. So I was able to convince the press to do this and not make the book too expensive, because I paid for the pictures and not the people who are buying the book are paying for the pictures. So I just think that makes the book, all the more accessible and more attractive to people who just want to get some feeling of what medieval life was like. So that was really important to me, to give that feeling of medieval life. Again, going back to Chava, I think that, all the things you said are well known, right? So the Midrash from Midrash Tanchuma about Chala, Nida, and Halakat Haner, that's well known. But to me, what was really, really important here was also talking about the imagery of Chava and Adam for chupot, for weddings, how they served as an ideal couple, and how they really set the stage for all couples. The place that Chava plays, not just if you think about the Sheva Brachot, which we're all familiar with, but also in songs sung in the medieval period that every medieval Jew would have known how to sing and probably would have understood because they're so simple. So I really just wanted to show how she was a part of every woman's life and how different stories were told about her, and her figure was developed in the Middle Ages, not just as a figure of sin, because the sin we all know about so well, but how many more aspects of the word of Chava as well. So of course I covered the sin in the chapter, but it's also my goal to cover other aspects of Chava and her life in that chapter, and to talk about something really interesting, right? Chava and Adam, they kind of both sinned together. But she's the one who's considered as the one who brought death to the world. But then if we look at it again, we can see how Chava and Adam together are remembered as the ideal first couple. So I really like that aspect, and it's very central in medieval life. So I thought it was really important to bring that back to life, because sometimes we just remember things that have trickled down to modernity rather than realizing the full repertoire of what medieval people had.
Right, and then the second chapter. So first of all, the second chapter, there's a bunch of Misha Berachs over here, which is interesting. It starts off, I'll read the English, Misha Berach, and may one who be blessed, Sarah, Rivka, Leah, and Chana, bless and cure. As you write, Mistress so-and-so, daughter of so-and-so, who's in difficult labor. So you go through the whole that, and it continues on. There's more there, and you work through a couple of different, you talk about Misha Berach formulas in medieval Ashkenazi culture. So we'll talk a little bit about this chapter and what you talk about in here, the second chapter.
I mean, when you go to shul, how do you participate? How are you part of the tefillah? Medieval women went to shul sometimes 3 times a day. They certainly went to shul on Shabbatot. So how were they part of the tefillah? How were people made to feel part? We know that there were a lot of different methods used by medieval communities. One method we're all really familiar with today is the Yizkor. That's another minhag that originated in Ashkenaz in the Middle Ages. You call upon your beloved ones and you remember them. Yizkor was said on different chagim. Different people were remembered every Shabbat during the year. The Misha Berachs were a way of drawing people in the community into the tefillah. And we can see that the Misha Berachs are really smart. A woman who's having a baby won't say Mishaberach that includes Rachel, because if you include Rachel, you're not doing very well for a woman who's in labor, right? So that's why you have Chana in there. Whereas somebody who's sick, you can include Rachel, but you can also talk about Miriam HaNeviah. And we also have here something that's kind of like, I'd say, a proto-rabbinic way of thinking. We also find it a lot in early Christianity, calling on these biblical figures. And one of my arguments is that this is still very much present in the Middle Ages. But perhaps the most important argument I tried to make through the Imahot was that often we talk about medieval Ashkenaz, and I've written a lot about this in my own work, during the 13th and 14th century, we see among the Jews, like among the Christians, a marginalization of women. If in the 11th and 12th century, we have Jewish women taking part in a lot of rituals and really being part of a lot of the communal life, we see women marginalized. By looking at the Imahot, I found those women. They were still part, their voices could still be heard, they were still being counted. And that was really important to me in this chapter.
Okay. Then the chapter 5, you said with Yiftach, that also is about every season. There's a couple things you talk about in there. You talk about, you can talk about what you want to talk about. There's Tkufa, which is very interesting, the different Tkufas of the year. I don't know if there are other things that you want to mention as well.
So I would just say that Tkufot, and we know that we always say when we do Hachrazat Rosh Chodesh every month, we say Hamolad Yeh. But for medieval people, not the Molad was not just the Molad was important, but also the Tkufa was important. When the Tkufa fell, the Tkufa is basically today in modern English, we would say the equinoxes and the solstices. So those are, the 4 parts of the year that we divided in according to the length of the days. Those were really important days in antiquity for the Romans, for the Greeks, for the Jews, for everybody. We have lots of different minhagim that have to do with that, but the minhagim that have to do with the Tkufa that we know from medieval Ashkenaz, we have evidence of them being kept until the Holocaust. So these are really long-lived minhagim. And the minhag that was really common in medieval Ashkenaz was not to drink water during the hours of the Tkufa. So during the actual hours of the solstice or the equinox, not drink the water. Now, I could talk about that for hours. I'm not going to talk about that for hours, but I will say that it has to do with minhagim like Maim Shalanu before Pesach. One of the reasons given for having the water rest is that you won't draw the water during the Tkufa and use water that you shouldn't be using for making the matzot. But what to me is the most interesting in this is that the Ashkenazim were very fierce about observing the Tkufa, whereas the Sephardim thought it was complete nonsense. The Ibn Ezra doesn't like it, Kimchi doesn't like it, Abu Draham doesn't like it, and Ibn Ezra says really fiercely, he says, anybody who keeps these minhagim of the Tkufa, psichat hanashim haskenot. This is, the conversation of old women. These are bubamaises. These are old wives' tales. To me, I love this because this told me what stories women were telling and why this was so important for people to be observing this minhag, because they felt that it really was so crucial for their well-being. Because if you're going to drink the water and be poisoned or swell up or have some kind of disease or whatever you believe, this tells you about something very constant in people's lives. Women were the ones who drew the water from the wells. Women were the ones who did most of the cooking, most of the baking, everything that had to do with water. So here we have a woman's practice. Now, what's fascinating here is that we have it connected to 4 biblical episodes, the main one being Bat Yiftach, the 4 Tkufot of the year, but each Tkufa, Tishrei, Tammuz, Nisan, and Tevet, each one of them was connected to specific biblical episodes. So to me, this was just another example of how central the Bible was in the lives of medieval people and specifically medieval women.
Okay, you said chapters 3 and 4 are a little different. So chapter 3 is at her husband's behest, Tver and Yael, and chapter 4 you have women as fiscal agents, charitable like Abigail. So how do chapter 3 and 4 differ here from the other chapters?
So chapter 3 and 4 are a little bit different because I'm trying to read a little bit against the grain. I think like if you go with Chava and the Imahot, that's kind of obvious, right? Like Chava, I wrote the paper that was the very, very basis for this chapter when I was a graduate student, right? Chava was like an obvious place. She was an obvious place to go to talk about women's lives, to talk about their practices, have her as an example. The Imahot also, I think we would all think about the Imahot as models for medieval Jewish women, for Jewish women at large, right? Even till today. And Bat Yiftach, once I found her, and she had to do so much with the kind of life cycle with martyrdom. I didn't talk about the martyrdom part, but you can read the book and find out more about that. So I won't go into that right now. We can have a teaser for the people listening to us. They can go and find out more about that by reading the book. And I do want to talk about the last chapter if we have time and make a point about that, that we haven't mentioned. So those 3 chapters were kind of the obvious to me. But then I started trying to read against the grain. And I thought about people like Dvorah, who was, a shofetet. She was a very unusual woman in the Bible already. What did medieval rabbis do with her? And what I discovered was that although rabbis throughout the generations, from the Talmud, through the Midrashim, through medieval rabbis, tried to minimize what she did, she kept emerging as a heroine. She kept emerging as this very important figure, as a shofetet. And nobody could really take away from her greatness. And so that was kind of one case. And that was a really interesting case to me to see how the rabbis tried to, and also the Christian leaders. It's not just the rabbis. This is not rabbi bashing. I'm just saying the hierarchy of men in the Middle Ages tried to make her into a kind of teacher. She was somebody who was beneath the men. They always try to emphasize how she was beneath the men. And Avot Rabbi and Natan, that I really focus on in the chapter, does a great job of turning her at her husband's behest. She becomes an example of Isha Tova Osa Ritzon Ba'ala. A good woman does what her husband tells her to do. That's not exactly the image of Devorah we would conjure up in our minds reading the Tanakh. And on early modern tombstones, it says, Tsnu'ah hayta kedvorah. She was modest like Devorah. Again, not exactly the image of Devorah most of us would have thinking of the Tanakh. So I tried to show how this worked, this kind of back and forth, and how she kept emerging, even though people kind of trying to keep putting her in the place they wanted her to be. So that was an interesting chapter from that point of view. It was kind of a very subversive chapter of pushback against these stories over time. Abigail is a different kind of case. I was really interested for my previous book in how women gave charity. Were they allowed to give charity on their own? Did they need their husband's permission? Those were questions that really, really interested me. In that book, I study actual lists of charity, and I show that women give by number no less charity than men. So that interested me there. But I was trying to find evidence of rabbis talking about women giving charity, and I couldn't find it. And I looked 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 until I hit upon it. It was like a code. It was like a code that when you said that, everybody knew what you were talking about. And they were talking about a woman who was giving charity on her own, sometimes against her husband's will, without his permission, which is something you weren't supposed to do according to the Gemara. Go to Masechet Bava Kama, you can read about it there, etc. So she became kind of like a code, and to me it was like cracking a medieval code. Once you figure out how medieval people talked about something, you could understand the phenomenon. And in the chapter, I actually show how Abigail goes from becoming a code for giving charity without your husband's permission to just a code of a charitable woman. So she became kind of run-of-the-mill, good Jewish woman who gives charity. And that's why you'll write on a tombstone, Tzedakah natna ke'Abigail. She gave charity like Abigail. This is not, nobody's writing on their wife's tombstone, oh, hooray for this woman. She always did against her husband's will. What they're saying is she was a good woman. She gave charity. She was a decent, devout, haguna, I would say in the medieval Hebrew. She was a good, upstanding Jewish woman.
Before we get to the last chapter, I want to mention one more thing about the illustrations. You mentioned before how you wanted to show the readers like what their life was like, but you mean by that, and I guess also that you also taking things out of the illustrations, right? How things are illustrated, you can show how their lives were and what they were doing and what they thought about things, the fact that they're illustrating things a certain way, right?
I mean, I'm not an art historian, so I didn't come to do kind of like, a programmatic analysis of each of the pictures. And maybe one of the critiques can be that I didn't do enough of the pictures. What I wanted people to see, first of all, was how colorful the Middle Ages were. Just Middle Ages are so colorful. We often think of the past as black and white. The past is not black and white. The past was full of colors. So that was point number one. Point number two, I wanted to show how much nuance could be conveyed by these images, by the clothes people are wearing, by what they have on their heads, by what they're holding in their hands. It just gives you a feeling of the material culture of the period. I'm not claiming, and this is the important point, that these are one-to-one. I'm not claiming that if you went into a medieval Jewish house, it would just look just like these pictures. Clearly, we have different, norms and different topi coming across here in these illustrations. But I did want to give my readers a feeling of what medieval people would have seen, how they would have chosen to depict themselves if they were given the option of depicting themselves. And certainly the clothes are a great example. I'll just give the example from Yael and Sisra, which is a topic I explore in the book. There are pictures of Sisra where you can know exactly what medieval knights wore. Every picture that shows you Yael killing Sisera, you know something about a different period and what the knights were at that period. So you can really learn a lot just from looking at the pictures.
Interesting. Okay, so the last chapter, which is titled From Medieval Life to the Bible and Back, is something I was going to get to. You have here a fascinating poem, it was composed by Eliezer of Worms, who is the Rekeach, as many listeners are familiar. So I'll let you talk about that.
Okay, so Eliezer of Worms, his wife Dolce, she was killed when his house was attacked by two criminals in the winter of 1196, and she and her two daughters were killed. Elazar and his son survived the attack, and we have a poem he wrote in her memory. He wrote it according to the Eshet Chayil, and he talks all about her life and all of her activities. She was an incredibly devout woman, very devoted to kiyum mitzvot. He uses zamama sadeh v'tikachayo, and he writes zamama la'asot mitzvot, right? She wanted to perform mitzvot all the time. She was really chasidah v'chasudah, and she taught her children. So many scholars have studied Dolce. By the way, I like to think of the Rokeach as Dolce's husband. I know he has many schuyot for himself, but I also like to think about him as Dolce's husband because she was Mefarneses Doto. She also was the person who supported him to open his yeshiva. Most medieval Jewish rabbis supported themselves. He's a very rare case of a rabbi who was supported by his wife, something maybe more modern to some of us or to some of the listeners of this podcast. And the question I wanted to ask here was, how many Dolces were there? We have one Dolce because she was killed and she happened to be married to a very important man who happened to write a poem about her and remember her in that way. But how many Dolces were there? And the idea I really wanted to put across in this chapter was that there were many Dolces. There were so many more than we imagined. And we shouldn't always see these women as exceptional. We don't see the rabbis as exceptional. So why should we see their wives or their daughters or their neighbors as exceptional? And this really gives a lot more resonance and a lot more kavod and really a place to the medieval women and the part they had. I would say for this podcast, I can use these terms maybe in preserving Am Yisrael. In other words, when we try to think about how Am Yisrael came to where we are today, it's not just because of the theology or the emunah, the karei emunah that different rabbanim passed down through the ages. It's not just because of their chokhmah, whether it's the Rambam or Rashi or Balat Tosafot or whoever maybe we might want to say. It's also because of the practice. What we do every day in our everyday life makes us who we are, no less than what we do when we try to think about our ideals. And that was really a point I was trying to make here from an academic, historical point of view, using academic tools.
I should correct myself, as you said, it's Eliezer of Worms, not Eliezer. I did that mistake on Twitter recently, and I got people who were like, it's not Eliezer. I'm like, okay, it's Eliezer. Okay, so something we discussed, but maybe not just want to emphasize as we wrap up is, so why these specific biblical women? Why did you pick and how did you pick these specific figures?
So I guess I had to have enough material to make it into a chapter. The only figure, well, there are two other figures I could have talked about. And both of whom my students have been working on, and that's why I stayed away from them. One is Miriam. Many books have been written about Miriam, the sister of Moshe, but of course, we also have a different, very important Miriam. We would probably call her Mary in English. She was the mother of a very important person who kind of changed the world and world religions, right? I'm talking, of course, about the Virgin Mary, about Mary, the mother of Jesus. And of course, that meant that the figure of Mary in the Middle Ages for Jews was really fraught. And maybe this is a point I haven't made enough talking today, is how every single chapter I talk about has a Christian parallel, because these figures were also really important in Christian society. And one of the things I do in the book is try to explore that as well, so people can understand how sometimes Jews were going with the flow and they were reading things the same way as their Christian neighbors, or their Christian neighbors were reading things the same way as them, because we know that some Christian scholars studied with Jewish rabbis and learned from them. And sometimes Jews were really pushing back. So one of my students wrote her thesis about Miriam, and other scholars have studied Miriam as well. So I kind of said, I don't need to cover that. And I say that very clearly in the introduction of the book. And the other figure who maybe could be talked about was Esther HaMalka, but we don't have as many practical things that have to do with Esther HaMalka in everyday life, which is why I stayed away from her. One of my current students, Hannah Teddy Schachter, is working on a medieval French queen, Queen Blanche of Castile in the 13th century. And she's finding never-ending parallels to Queen Esther, because this Christian queen saw herself as an Esther. So I think Teddy, my student Teddy, or as she calls herself Teddy, but her full name is Hannah Teddy Schachter, she will end up writing the Esther chapter. And this was not meant to be, a finite study. I think everything I did in this book can be continued in lots of other directions. I don't think any of us ever have the last word. I think it's just ideas for other people to work with afterwards. So I hope that, my students and other people's students and other people will have new tacks from this and come to this in new ways. But for me, this was really just a way of saying, how do we get into the mindset of medieval people? What were the stories they told themselves? What were the ideas they thought about? The Tanakh was super important. And for medieval men and women, the stories of the Avot and Imahot, I focused on the Imahot, but we could also talk about the Avot, were also important. In some ways, if I had focused on Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the book would have become unmanageable. And part of what you want to do when you write a book is you want to write something that you can read, you can bite size it, you can take each piece and understand it. And I don't think I could have done that about any of the Avot, about whom we have so many traditions. It would have ended up being kind of like a catalog rather than a book that was focused on daily life and practice.
One other point of emphasis is that there are many, many quotations from Sfarim in here. Just flipping through, just want to emphasize that. Here's from quoting from Raivan, here you're quoting from Smak, here you're quoting from Tashbat, which is not Tashbat's Kata, not the Tashbat's, the Chuvas, the one that's a Talmud of Rambam Rotenberg. Then you're quoting Sefer Chasidim or Zerua. So there's countless quotations from Sfarim here. I just want to emphasize that.
Yeah, I mean, they're my best buddies, right? Like they're the people who I don't know if I want to actually meet them. I don't know if it's my dream to go back and meet them. I'd rather meet Dolce than meet Elazar if I have to choose between the two of them. But these are the people I spend my days with. I mean, I spend my mornings, my nights, my afternoons with these people. I read them all the time. And I argue with them. I argue with them. I try to struggle with them. I try to understand what they're talking about. I try to understand the context in which they're living. I try to understand why they're saying what they're saying, what the world they're living in is. And to hear via their words, the actions, the beliefs, the hopes, the prayers of the medieval people. I mean, for me, these medieval people are really the rabbis and their communities are really my heroes and heroines. And they're the people who I think are so meaningful for us today as modern Jews as well.
So we mentioned your earlier books, some of them you mentioned. So how do your earlier books, you want to just mention them, at least in this context, how do they differ from this one? And what are they about?
So Mothers and Children, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2004, really is about the first 7 years of a child's life. So it goes from birth to age 7, following the child and seeing how their parents took care of them, with a lot of comparisons between how Jewish parents took care of their children and Christian parents took care of their children, where ideology comes in, when it makes a difference and when it doesn't. And one of the critiques of the book in a book review was that, of course, Baumgarten found similarities between Jews and Christians. Of course, you have to feed babies, you have to diaper them, you have to, make sure they go through the first years of life. What did she expect? Sadna de arachadhu, all people are the same. Why would we expect to find something so different between Jews and Christians? And I think at that point in my career, I was still very intent on showing that Jews and Christians were similar, that they weren't so different. I think then I kind of flipped and I went through a very different phase. Following that bikoret, following that critique, the critic said, he said, if Baumgarten had actually studied the stuff of everyday religious life, like the real thing that made a Jew, tefillot, the way they performed their religious ritual, she would have found far more differences between Jews and Christians. So then I wrote Practicing Piety. Practicing Piety is basically about tshuvat, tefillah, tzedakah, with a few additions, but how Jews perform their everyday religious ritual. That's when I became interested in everyday as a term. And I really took each of these different categories: fasting, davening, giving tzedakah, performing mitzvot aseh shazman grama, in my case, because I was interested in men and women, Jews and Christians. And I did this kind of quadra comparison in all the chapters. So it was about very, very specific practices. This book, which was on the way to my book about marriage, like I said, it was because I found so much marriage imagery for Chava and for the Imahot that I kind of went in this direction. I had already written before about Bat Yiftach and about Avigail, and I added the Dvorah and Yael chapter. So I kind of had two chapters that already existed as independent pieces, Avigail and Bat Yiftach. Then on my way to understanding marriage and understanding the marriage liturgy, I discovered Chava and the Imahot so powerfully, and then I added the Dvorah chapter. But this book was really saying, okay, I know what people did. I'm interested in what people did. I'm interested in their practice. But what did they believe? What stories did they tell themselves? And if you read my acknowledgement, one of the things I talk about in the acknowledgement is how the stories we're told as children shape us and who we are as adults. I thank my parents, so this is an opportunity to thank them here also for making me who I am today. And of course, my family, my husband and my children and their future families for the stories that I hope they'll tell their children, but really thinking about what stories do people know? What do they tell themselves? How do they explain to themselves? And that was how I came to this book. It's part of a much bigger project I'm involved in today, which is called Beyond the Elite, Jewish Daily Life in Medieval Europe, that I've been doing with my students for the past 6 years. And we've been examining almost every aspect of daily life: economics, judgment, oath-taking, masculinity, being a father. What does it mean? One of my students has studied that topic. Expulsions, but also living among the goyim in every day and doing your business with them. I mean, we've examined so many different aspects of everyday life together. And this is really a project that the sum is much greater than any part. And I've learned so much from my students, how people built their buildings, how Jews built their buildings, how they sealed their letters. I mean, so many everyday practice, how they prepared for Shabbat. I'm just going through all the topics my students have worked on over the past years. And maybe something that will be interesting to the listeners is one of the things we did over the past years is we produced an exhibit that's based on sources that each student wrote about, a different source from the Middle Ages. And then we met with 7 Israeli artists, among them a Sofer Stam. And we had the artists produce what they could artistically based on our sources. The exhibit is open in Jerusalem now. You can go like on a virtual tour online and actually feel like you're in the exhibit, and it's opening in Germany in the fall in an old synagogue in the city of Erfurt, in the old synagogue there. So we've really tried to understand medieval Jewish life through as many channels as possible and engage with it through as many channels as possible. And now that that project is coming to an end, I hope to write my book on marriage. And I hope also to focus on a century that's really been ignored, which is the 14th century. It was a terrible century for medieval Jews. The Jews were expelled and killed and persecuted. But I hope to focus on that century with the understanding that throughout all that, Jews still lived, and to also understand Jewish life throughout that terrible time, rather than just saying, oh, it was a terrible time, but to understand how Jews dealt with that time as well. And I'd say that that project is really coming about thanks to my students who have put a lot of pressure on me to go in that direction and think about those things. So I guess that kind of sums up my work to date, and really my interest in people today and in the past and understanding their lives.
Very interesting. So I will link to all your books. I'll put the link, of course, to this new book. And like I said, it's a little bit bigger with the glossy pages, color photos. It's only $50. It's really for a book like this, with academic presses. This is really, well priced, so to speak. But there also maybe a promo code I'll get from you, put in the show's notes as well. That could be even cheaper. And then your other books I'll link as well. If, as you described, if people want to learn more about day-to-day life than what this book does, they can buy those and read those as well.
And I will just say that our catalog is free and downloadable. So I'll send you a link for that as well. It's beautiful, but it's also downloadable, and you can download it for free. So anybody who wants to have a free taste can also have a look at that.
Great. Okay. So I'll add that link to the show's notes as well. And with that, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much.